Hello, everyone. My name is Ayush, and I'm excited to share with you research conducted by Professor Anjali Adukia, Callista Christ, Anjali Das, and myself. I'll be presenting how race and gender have been portrayed in 100 years of children's literature. First, let's take a look at the sentences on this slide. What do these sentences have in common? As in, I wanted a pair of Stefan Marbury sneakers, Starburys, but dad called him a selfish millionaire with a bad attitude. And why would I want to be associated with such a churlish choke artist? The second sentence, to say it again for emphasis, MiiE was worse than ever, if possible. And the third sentence, poor Martha without husband or child to make living sweet. All of these sentences are from award-winning children's books from the past century. Yet the messages behind these sentences might lead a child to think negatively about African-American basketball players, or to believe that women need a husband and child to make living sweet, especially if these messages are repeated multiple times throughout the same book or across different books. Children's books can actually transmit messages that can influence the perceptions, assumptions, and attitudes of the next generation. And the way that people of different identities are portrayed in children's books can send subconscious messages about how positively or negatively children should think about people with those identities. In this study, we examine how race and gender are portrayed in children's books. We analyze both novels and books with images and pictures. In order to perform this analysis, we find the sentiment towards characters of different race and gender identities. Sentiment analysis is the process of identifying positive or negative attitudes in a certain piece of text, and it's a great indicator of what a reader thinks about a character. For example, if there is a positive sentiment towards a character in a book, that means the reader will also most likely have positive feelings towards that character or people with the same identities as that character. Sentiment analysis is a form of machine learning, and although AI and machine learning is more efficient than performing traditional content analysis, and it allows us to draw from the perspectives of multiple different authors, it does reflect the biases of the people who train it. We use AI and machine learning because of the tools available. This is one tool which allows us to look at lots of books at a very broad level. Additionally, we understand how local consumer beliefs relate to purchasing behavior. And in order to understand how race and gender are portrayed to children, we analyze award-winning children's books from the last century, recognized by the Association for Library Service to Children. The books in our dataset are split into the mainstream collection and the diversity collection. The mainstream collection books are selected for their high literary or artistic value. Many of these books are more likely to be checked out and purchased because the awards on the front covers of these books are quite noticeable, and these awards are quite well known. Additionally, these books are considered to be part of the canon of children's literature. An example of a Newbery Medal winning book was Lois Lowry's The Giver, and an example of a Caldecott Medal winning book was Rapunzel by Paul Zelinsky. The mainstream collection in our dataset consists of books that had won the Newbery and the Caldecott Medal between the decades of the 1920s and the 2010s. In the diversity collection, we selected books for how they center underrepresented identities. These books may represent an upper bound of existing representation, winning awards such as the Coretta Scott King Award and the Schneider Family Book Award. Additionally, the books in our diversity collection came from the decades of between the 1970s and the 2010s. In this research, we evaluated our data at two levels, by collection only and by both collection and decade. In this graph, we can see the number of books that had won each award across all the different decades in our dataset. We see the pink dots representing mainstream books and the blue dots representing diversity books. And the Caldecott and the Newbery medals are the oldest children's book awards in the United States, dating back to the 1920s and the 1930s. But up until the 1970s, only one author of color had won either of these awards. And therefore, new awards such as the Coretta Scott King Award and the Carter G. Woodson Award were created to highlight authors from different backgrounds. In this research, we analyzed the portrayal of race and gender of famous characters in these children's books. We analyzed the sentiment associated with famous figures for multiple reasons. First, famous figures are role models. There's more salience attached to these characters, and they contribute to the aspirations and beliefs of children. Additionally, they're real people that children can read and learn about. Also, we analyze sentiment associated with famous figures because we can classify the race and the gender of famous figures with higher accuracy than we can classify the race and gender of non-famous figures. The data preprocessing pipeline begins with the collection of text from the books using optical character recognition. The books in our dataset are stored as scans, and we use OCR to take the text from the scan and convert it into text that the computer can read. We then analyze that text using named entity recognition, or NER. We use NER to extract entities from that text, entities meaning first and last names. And we plug in those first and last names to the Pantheon 2.0 dataset, which contains over 70,000 famous figures and their Wikipedia biographies. Using the Pantheon dataset, we can identify if a named entity is a famous figure. And therefore, once we identify whether the named entity is a famous figure, we can get their gender from the Pantheon dataset, and we can manually code their race. So we can replace the name of the character with the identifying demographic information. So for example, Rosa Parks in a sentence would be replaced by the string black_female. And finally, we create an organized dataset which contains these altered sentences. Here's an example of the data preprocessing pipeline. The scan from The Voice That Challenged a Nation, Marian Anderson and the Struggle for Equal Rights, is first converted into actual text using OCR, and we use NER to identify Marian Anderson, the character. Finally, we replace Marian Anderson with the identifying demographic information, black_female. This graph shows the number of mentions by race and by gender of famous figures in the mainstream, pink, and diversity, blue collections. We see that in the mainstream collection, white male characters are mentioned far more often than characters of any other race-gender combination. And in the diversity collection, white male characters and black male characters are mentioned quite often, and far more often than white female and black female characters. The sentiment analysis pipeline begins with the selection of a model to perform the sentiment analysis. We chose between the variety of different available BERT models, BERT base, BERT large, Roberta, etc. And we had to choose a model that best understood our data. To find which model best understood our data, we evaluated each model with a masked language modeling, or MLM task. Essentially, we took a random sentence from our dataset and gave it to the model, asking it to predict the last word in that sentence. And we found that all of the BERT models performed similarly on this task. So we decided to fine-tune all of the BERT models on the Stanford Sentiment Tree Bank, or SST5, dataset. We have to fine-tune these models because BERT is a general purpose language model. It is not built specifically for sentiment analysis. We use the SST5 dataset to fine-tune it because of the SST5's SST5 dataset's similarities to our own data. Each data entry is a complete sentence and has 5 different sentiment labels: very negative, negative, neutral, positive, and very positive. Finally, once we fine-tune each of the BERT models, we found the model that performed best on our custom-created test set, which included sentences from our own dataset. And we found that the BERT base uncased model performed best on this test set. So we decided to use it to make predictions on the rest of the data. This graph shows the number of sentences that were classified in each class: very negative, negative, neutral, positive, and very positive. Most sentences are classified as neutral, but of the sentences that were not classified as neutral, there were more sentences classified as negative rather than positive. In this graph, we can see the average sentiment by race and gender. On the left, we can see the average sentiment towards Black and white characters in mainstream and diversity books, and on the right, we can see the same for female and male characters. We see that most groups are portrayed in a positive light, except for Black characters in mainstream books. Additionally, something important to note is that female characters in mainstream books are portrayed in a positive light, at least according to this graph. However, once we dig deeper, we see that although white female characters are portrayed with a positive average sentiment in mainstream books, Black female characters in mainstream books actually have a negative average sentiment. But because there are more white female characters mentioned than Black female characters mentioned, the positive sentiment towards white female characters masks the negative sentiment towards Black female characters. Additionally, we can see the sentiment by race over time in the mainstream books. We see that the average sentiment towards white characters has remained more positive than the average sentiment towards Black characters. And the sentiment towards Black characters, however, has been increasing over time. In the 1990s, we see an exception to the rule of white characters have a more positive average sentiment. We see that in the 1990s, Black characters have a more positive average sentiment. This may be due to the multiculturalism movement, which was a movement that advocated for the portrayal of more diversity and more representation, especially in education. This may be one reason why in the 1990s, Black characters have a more positive average sentiment. And we can also see the average sentiment by race over time in the diversity category. We see that the average sentiment of Black and white characters in diversity books has remained positive over time. We can also see the sentiment by gender over time in mainstream books. The average sentiment towards male, orange, and female, blue characters between the 1920s and the 2010s. We can see that in the 1920s, there was quite a big gap between the male and female average sentiments, but by the 2000s and the 2010s, that gap had essentially disappeared, meaning that the average sentiment towards female and male characters has actually converged over the past century. Finally, we can see the sentiment by gender over time. We can see in the diversity books the average sentiment towards male and female characters between the 1970s and the 2010s. The average sentiment towards both female and male characters in these diversity books has remained positive over time. Finally, we look at the relationship between book purchases and consumer beliefs. We see that books with a more positive sentiment towards Black characters are more likely to be purchased by people who believe that white people in the US have certain advantages because of the color of their skin, and by people who are angry that racism exists. In conclusion, we list out a few points here to summarize the entire project. First, a century ago, women were less positively spoken about than male characters, and the sentiment of females and male characters has converged over time. Additionally, the differences in sentiment associated with Black characters and white characters has decreased over time, but a gap still remains. We also saw that the average sentiment surrounding women is positive overall in mainstream books. However, because there are more white women mentioned in mainstream books and white female characters are portrayed positively, this masks the negative sentiment towards Black female characters. And finally, we see that individuals who believe that white people in the US have certain advantages because of the color of their skin and who are angry that racism exists are more likely to purchase books with positive sentiment towards Black characters. Overall, it's important to understand the implicit and explicit messages transmitted to children through the content that they are given. And this research is one step towards understanding that content in more detail so that we can shape a more equitable future for the next generation. Thank you so much for watching. Feel free to reach us at team@miilab.com and visit our website at miilab.com. And you can scan the QR code to find the full paper. Thank you.